The concepts of race and ethnicity are so complex and so fraught. Perhaps we should just stop thinking about these categories. Stop asking people to check boxes. Just move on from all of this. I want to now present some scientific evidence that supports both sides of this suggestion. A reason why perhaps we should or could, and a reason why perhaps we really can't. On the maybe we should just ignore it side of the debate, I introduce you to a study by Steve Chapman from the Center for Studies in Higher Education here at UC Berkeley. In 2010, he published a study in the New Directions for Institutional Research journal. His analysis was aimed at addressing the question, does academic discipline affect perception of campus climate? His results show that any study assuming that race and ethnicity are the primary contributor to student welfare on campus, is oversimplifying the complexity of people's experiences. Let's take a look at that study. Here's his methodology. The data that Chapman analyzed were from an undergraduate experience survey of 60,000 students at all 8 large UC campuses. So this was the 2008 University of California Undergraduate Experience Survey. It provides a measurement of interpersonal and diversity skills, campus climate, overall satisfaction and inclusion, and individual characteristics such as political, religious beliefs, social class, family income, gender, race and ethnicity, and sexual orientation. And as I mentioned, it's from around 60,000 students from all 8 large UC campuses. And so at the time, UC Merced's undergraduate student body was deemed too small to include, and UCSF, that does not have an undergraduate program, were not included. Now, Chapman's analyses were aimed at identifying where various answers to this survey aligned. So patterns of similarity. Not exactly interested in, he didn't actually look at what the answers were. He didn't report what they were. So keep that in mind as we look at the results, that he's looking for similarity in answers, not specifically what the answer was. Now, in this table, the column on the left lists the various factors that questions were aimed at addressing. And you'll see core factors that include a sense of belonging and satisfaction, cultural appreciation and social awareness, and gains in cultural appreciation and social awareness. Excuse me. Other factors include feelings about the campus climate for the respondent individually, feelings about freedom of expression, and for a sense of whether or not the respondent feels respected. There were also scores for whether or not the respondent feels as though faculty and staff are prejudiced, or if they have political prejudice. There were also questions to score the respondents' feelings about the prejudices of other students on campus, and also an assessment of the respondents' interpersonal skills at empathy and sensitivity. Now, the 5 columns to the right of this indicate how much responses to these categories clustered with similar responses to the topics listed on the left. So you have data on race and ethnicity, and we see that the scores are highest in the core factors of having a sense of belonging, cultural appreciation, and social awareness. So this means that people who had similar answers for race and ethnicity also had similar responses to questions about their sense of belonging and satisfaction on campus. For academic discipline, we see that people who responded similarly for academic discipline, i.e. people with the same major, they reported feeling similarly about the core factors of cultural appreciation and social awareness, and in their interpersonal skills and sensitivity. And then we have sexual orientation, political orientation, and family income. And again, we see clusters in how these individuals responded to different components of this climate survey. Now I want to, hold on, I need to see my screen a little bit better here. Sorry. Now, I want to draw your attention to the numbers at the bottom. So when you add up the major critical factors in these analyses, which you can see at the bottom of the table, so race and ethnicity has a score of 17. The clustering of responses by academic discipline, that has a score of 16. We see that sexual orientation, 15, political orientation, 12, and family income, 11. This can be a little confusing, so let me actually show these results in a different way that might help if seeing it in this tabulated form doesn't kind of give you much satisfaction. Okay, so let's look at this differently. So do you remember how we looked at genetic variation as a tree, that the longer the branch of the tree, the more different the genetic sequences, that there was distance, the branching indicates distance, i.e. difference. So a very similar type of analysis is done here, but with survey data. These graphs are showing how similarly different groups responded to the survey questions. Okay. At the top of the slide, we see that Christians and non-affiliated spiritual students responded most similarly to each other, and that Jewish and students who identify as not religious were more distant from Christian students in their responses. Let's look at family income now. You'll notice that the topography of this tree is pretty different from the last one we were just looking at. There are two major branches. The top branch, it clusters students from families with incomes of $50,000 a year and lower. And then the bottom branch of cluster, the bottom cluster, this clusters students from families with incomes of $65,000 a year and incomes that are $200,000 a year or higher. So this shows that students from lower income backgrounds have notably different responses to the campus climate survey compared to students from modest and more wealthy backgrounds. The split point is actually around $50,000, around $65,000 a year in family income. And those two groups of students have different and more similar to each other perspectives on the campus climate. Now, let's look at sexual orientation. Here, students who do not identify as heterosexual all responded more similarly to each other than did people who identify as heterosexual. So the divide in perspective on the campus climate is between people who identify as heterosexual and people who do not. In terms of political orientation, students who identify as conservative and very conservative responded to the campus climate survey very differently compared to all other groups. And what about academic discipline? There are two clusters in the top branch of the tree. There's social sciences and the humanities that clustered together. And then there is the sciences. There are the sciences. Life and natural sciences, but also business management sneaks in there too. And then math, computer science, and physical sciences, and engineering. So the survey results show that students in the same major field of study answered the questions on campus climate survey more similarly to each other than they did compared to students in other majors. And now I want to draw your attention to this group that responded quite distinctly from all other majors: area and ethnic studies. The authors aren't sure if students who feel very differently about their place on campus are drawn to these areas of study, or if being in that academic discipline makes students more aware of campus climate and therefore leads to different responses in how they are perceiving campus climate. And now, race and ethnicity. There are 3 clusters in the top part of the tree. So there is a major divergence, and then within the top side of that divide, you have 3 clusters. So you have clustering together Japanese, East Indian, and Pakistani, and other. You have Thai, white people and people who decline to state what their race and ethnicity are, and then you have Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean clustering. There is another cluster that is the Chicano, Mexican American, Latino, and Filipino. So three major clusters there. And again, there is one group that responded quite differently from the other groups and similar to each other. And these are students who identify as Black and African American. So what these results show is that views on the campus climate across the University of California, they cluster, but not just on race and ethnicity. They cluster to a similar degree for students from family incomes below $50,000 a year, for students in the same major area of study, for students who identify as heterosexual or not heterosexual in their sexual orientation, for people in terms of their political orientation, and also for religious beliefs. So people are not just one thing. We have multiple influences on our identity and our sense of belonging in a group. And this also suggests that you can just about always find something that you have in common with another person. And in that commonality, you'll find that your perspectives align. So, does this mean that perhaps we should just ignore race and ethnicity? Now, let's make the case for why we can't. These arguments fall into 2 categories. First, ignoring variation doesn't make it irrelevant. Just because, and also that just because you want to, or not, it doesn't, excuse me, I don't speak very clearly here. So just because you want race and ethnicity to be irrelevant, that does not make it so for the rest of our society at large. And second, people see variation, and things that we see we need to make sense of. Primates are highly visual animals. We're highly social animals. We notice differences between individuals. Millions of years of evolution have made us highly attuned to the visual differences between each other. Things we notice are things that we then need to understand. We feel a need to understand them. There was a wonderful series of psychology studies that asked the question, do babies discriminate? This research was done by Phyllis Katz out of the University of Colorado. Her study included 200 children, 100 white and 100 Black children, and she followed them over the first 6 years of their life. Here's the study. Now, when babies were 6 months old, the researchers showed them photographs of faces with a variety of skin tones. They noticed that the babies looked at the images of faces with skin tones that differed from their parents for longer than they looked at faces with the same skin tone as their parents. So the conclusion out of this is that babies notice that people have different skin tones, and they are intrigued by the people who are different from the faces they mostly see in their day-to-day lives. 6-month-old babies notice differences in skin color. When the children were 3 years old, they were shown pictures of other children and asked, "Who would you like to be friends with?" 86% of them chose their own race, as defined by skin color. When they were 5 and 6 years old, the children were given cards with pictures of people on them, and they were asked to sort them into categories. They could use any criteria they wanted to sort them on. They were not told what to sort them by. And what the scientists found is that 68% of the children sorted the cards on race, on skin color, and 16% of them use gender expression. So when I was growing up, there was this idea that if adults said nothing about skin color, that us kids wouldn't notice it, we wouldn't focus on it, that we would be blind to race. But as Phyllis Katz's research has shown, and I quote her, "I think it is fair to say that at no point in the study did the children exhibit the Rousseau type of color blindness that many adults would have expected." Children, small children, notice differences between people. They noticed variation. They notice variation in skin color. And if we don't help them understand why there are differences, they will make up their own reasons. There's a wonderful story about a journalist who had tried this colorblind approach with their children. And they were driving, and they had, their preschool age kids in the back seat of the car talking. And one child said something about, something about dark skin, and the other kid said, "Shh, no. We're not allowed to talk about skin color. Adults, it's really, really serious, and adults will get mad at you if you talk about skin color." And the parent realized that children are going to make sense of this in some way. And isn't it better for us, adults, to make sure that their understanding of skin color variation is the one that we want them to have? The one that you now know, the scientific understanding of pigment as sunscreen. So to summarize, biological race, it does not equate with ethnicity. Race, as it is used in social political settings, is a very different thing than what it means in biology. It has some sort of similarities to subspecies, but many, many differences. And it's invalid in humans anyway because we do not have subspecies in our species. Race, as it is used in social political settings, it changes over time, and it varies across cultures. Human interaction and a sense of inclusion, it's multifactorial. It's not just about race and ethnicity. And that not talking about race, it does not make the issue go away. So we have to have these conversations, even though they can be uncomfortable and they are hard. So for the next experience in this module, we'll dive into the ways that the social construct of race influences people's lives. We'll do this by first picking up our conversation from the last module about IQ and the hereditarian theory of intelligence.